Today we're showing you how to LS swap a second gen Camaro. Now, full disclosure, this is our first time doing this and we have made a ton of mistakes, but hopefully you can learn from them. We're gonna show you what to do and what not to do so that when you do this, it will go much more smoothly. Now let's start with the car. When we were thinking about this project, we wanted a rolling shell, something desirable, something with emotional appeal, something muscle car but not too expensive, that we could drop a modern drivetrain in and have a car that was fast, reliable, comfortable, and something that when we were done, we could sell it and make a profit. And we ended up finding a 1978 real Z28 Camaro. This was an abandoned race car that we found in a storage shed. It came with tons of extra parts, so we bought it and trailered it home. Now, once we got it to the shed, it turned out to be much more of a shell and a much bigger project than we had originally intended. Brakes go to the floor, so they must not be hooked up all the way. There's no cluster, there's no HVAC stuff. The other thing we got to figure out is keys. We have no keys to anything, so. Is there even a fuse box in here? There's not a fuse box or a harness besides like that interior thing, so there's no wiring. Not only did it not have a drivetrain, it didn't have brakes, AC, heat gauges, a cluster, anything under the dash. It didn't even have wiring or a fuel system. So we had our work cut out for us. Now our goal for this car was not to just have a drag car we could take down the racetrack. We wanted a great cruising car, something you could get in and drive every day that was fast enough to upset some people at the track, but comfortable and reliable enough that you could take it on a cross-country road trip. And one of the things that we wanted to do in this project was figure out if some of the cheaper solutions that you find on YouTube or that you find on the internet are actually viable solutions. So we wanted to try to go cheap, DIY, figure it out where we could. And if we found out that that didn't work, let you know that you should spend money on this part because it's gonna be a hassle. And we did find a couple things like that. So after we found the car, we needed a drivetrain and we lucked out on a complete donor vehicle. All right, there's the Suburban. This thing has 0 brakes. There are no brakes whatsoever, no parking brake, anything. So trying to get it to where I can work on it is kind of a chore sometimes. We were able to pick it up for $500 and get almost everything we could potentially need for this swap. Now there's a lot of different ways to source a motor. You can go to a junkyard, you can go to a pick and pull type place, or you can find a donor vehicle, and there's a trade-off for each one. With our donor vehicle, we have all kinds of extra parts. We have all the wiring, the PCM, the harness, hoses and lines, and a cluster, and anything that we could think of, we can pull off that vehicle. But pulling an engine, while it may not be the hardest thing in the world, it's not my favorite thing to do. But you can also go to a junkyard, hear something run, and have them pull it for you. Now the drawback is that you're gonna be missing some extra parts. The times that we've bought an engine from a yard, it's ended up missing a starter or some key things, and we've had to go chase down parts, and it's cost a little bit more. The engine out of our Suburban is a fairly basic LM7 5.3. They had just shy of 300 horsepower from the factory. So once we pulled the engine, we did the cam and valve springs, we detailed the engine, painted it, made it look nice to get it ready to drop in the Camaro. So our next thing to prepare was the transmission. We used the stock 4L60E out of the donor Suburban. Now the internet loves to hate on 4L60Es because they go bad or they break, but since this is a normally aspirated car, it's not a dedicated race car, and we're not gonna put a turbo on it, we decided the 4L60E would be sufficient for our uses. If you were gonna make a lot more power or go turbo, we would suggest finding a 4L80E. This would complicate your swap. You need a couple more parts to make it work, but that would be the solution we would use. Since our Suburban ran and drove fine, we decided we put a Transgo shift kit in the transmission along with the Transgo high RPM spring kit. Now, if you're familiar with 4L60E transmissions, when they go bad, there's debate on whether they go bad because they have too much power put behind them or because they're revved too high and they're not made for high RPM. So the high RPM spring kit is supposed to help these survive at higher RPM shift points. Because we put a bigger cam and shifted our power band up higher in the RPM range, we thought this would be a necessary thing. Now, once we had the trans apart, we decided to put a new 3-4 clutch pack in the transmission. The thing looked like it had almost no wear on it, but since the 3-4 clutch pack is the first thing to go bad once these things start to get old and slip a little bit, we decided it was cheap insurance to help our car run and drive the best that we could make it run. For a torque converter, this is a place where we tried to save a little bit of money. We went with a stock Trailblazer torque converter that would normally be behind the 4.2 liter inline 6, the Atlas engine. This is the highest stall factory converter that GM ever made to put behind a 4L60E, and we could pick one up remanufactured for about $100. Next was the oil pan. If you know anything thing about these swaps, the truck engine's oil pan is about 8 inches deep, and if you swap it into an old car or a muscle car, it's gonna stick down 3 to 4 inches and potentially bottom out, leak all your oil out, and ruin that engine. Well, there's a bunch of solutions, but they can get pretty costly. And when you're trying to do a cheap LS swap and maybe only spend a couple $100s on your donor engine, spending $300 to $400 on an oil pan may seem like it's gonna bust your budget, but you need to make sure you have a good solution for this. What we decided to do was cut and section our oil pan. Now, this is not the easiest job in the world. You need to know how to weld aluminum. Our result might be a little bit ugly, but it's functional and it didn't really cost us anything but time. But since we haven't started or driven the car yet, the jury's kind of out on whether that's an effective solution or not. Our next score was headers. We scored some Hooker Blackheart stainless steel headers on sale for $79, which is an unbelievable deal because these headers are usually $1,100. Now, if you really wanted to save money, you could just use your stock truck manifolds, fab up some exhaust, and it may make some things easier down the line. Now, the next obstacle to tackle was our engine mounts. We decided to fabricate our own engine mounts because we've seen online that there are templates for motor mount plates that are fairly simple. Our goal was to make sure that the engine and trans was fore and aft just right so that we wouldn't have to get a new drive shaft made. The 4L60E is about the same size as a Turbo 350, which the car originally had, and it uses the same drive shaft yoke. So if we could get the distance right, we would save ourselves some money and some work there. The nice thing is the 4L60E bolts right up to that stock TH350 cross member, and if you need to move it fore or aft, you can just drill a couple more holes in the frame. Now here's what I'll say about the homemade motor mounts. Because our Camaro was a former race car, it didn't have the stock rubber clamshell mounts. Instead, it had some kind of weird non-stock engine mounts that were already in it, and it complicated the process. We spent a lot of time fabricating up mounts. The other thing we found was that our Hooker Blackheart headers required very specific engine mounts from Holley. Oh yeah, these don't fit. There's no way. No way those are fitting. We did get our homemade engine mounts to work with the placement of the headers and the engine, but when I went to finish weld, I had put so much heat in them that the rubber ended up disintegrating in the mounts, so I just ordered some engine mounts online, which means I wasted a lot of time in fabrication work. So my advice there would just be to order the right mounts. Next on the list is our fuel system, and since the Camaro was already cut up and it already had a fuel cell, we decided to use that fuel cell, eventually fabricate our own trunk floor pan out of aluminum, and then use an external pump and the Corvette combination fuel filter and regulator. So we're gonna come out of the fuel cell straight into that big pre-filter, and then it's gonna go into this external pump, GSL 392. I believe this is one of those Bosch 040. And then this is going into a Corvette filter regulator. It has the feed and then the return line. So our return line only needs to be maybe 2 feet. Then our final decision was what to do with the wiring and PCM. Now, we were originally going to use Holley Terminator X because it's a turnkey solution. You get your wiring harness, you get your computer, and it will power any of the LS engines as well as the transmission. They come with their own little screen and you can tune from a laptop. But halfway through the build, we decided to change our mind, cut our budget back just a little bit, and use the stock computer and harness, and then tune the whole setup with HP tuners. Well, there are plus and minuses to both. In actuality, you only save maybe a couple $100 going with the HP tuners, factory PCM, and wiring solution. We wanted HP tuners for some of the other builds we were doing, and we wanted to get back into tuning. If you're going this route, you might have a little bit of complication with the wiring. We used a website called lt1swap.com, which gives you all kinds of info on how to cut down and thin out your harness if that's something that you want to do. But the thing to think about here is how much you'll actually spend on the whole solution. With the Holley setup, you get the harness, the PCM, everything in one package. It doesn't cost you any more to tune that vehicle on your own unless you're going to take it to a tuner and pay for their time. But the Holley unit also has self-tuning capabilities. You're able to dial in that setup on your own, and from what I understand, it's fairly simple. Using a stock PCM, on the other hand, you'll need someone to flash the PCM to at least get it started, because all of these have something called VATS, which is like an anti-theft device. And if you're doing a cam swap or doing any kind of mods, you're going to want it tuned so that it will start and idle and actually run. It may seem like the setup is free to use the stock PCM and harness, but you're going to have to pay somebody to do that initial tune. That may be a couple $100. Or if you're going to invest in HP tuners, you're going to be paying around $250 to $500 for the software and the interface, depending on which options you get. And then you're going to have to pay for your credits on top of that. For our car, it's going to cost $100 for the credits. And if you don't know how to tune, you're going to have to pay somebody to tune that as well. So it may end up being a wash on the cost. So how far have we got? Well, things are in. We are in the middle middle of buttoning up a bunch of other systems, and we haven't fired up the engine for the first time yet, but we will do that soon. Also, this was just a pretty general overview of the swap, and we definitely plan on coming out with some in-depth videos on each of those topics. Your cam and valve spring swap, putting the shift kit in the transmission, building a fuel system. These will all be individual in-depth videos that we'll bring to you. So if that interests you, make sure that you subscribe so that you can see those videos when they come out. Also, we would love to hear what you want to know from this project. Let me know what you're working on, what kind of in-depth information or videos you would like us to make in the comments below this video. We will read every single one and put those in our list of videos to make in the future. Thanks for watching. We appreciate your time, and happy swapping.